Welcome back, kids and coaches. And today we are getting into learning outcome 3 within unit 2. So, what we're going to be working on today primarily is force production from our muscle contractions. And we'll also be talking about how we go about doing that with an action potential. So, let's jump right into it. First thing to note here is that when we actually contract a muscle, the contraction occurs in every single muscle fiber. So once that action potential, or once the cross bridge occurs, you get every single muscle fiber going and making that cross bridge, causing your contraction to occur. We'll talk about motor units here next, but overall, you get energy through ATP. And as we discussed last time, that energy source is the glycogen found within the muscle itself. So remember, within your sarcoplasm, you have glycogen, which is housed right around each of your muscle fibers. Now, one thing that I wanted to mention here was this notion of hypertrophy. What this means is that you have muscle growth. Now, when your muscles get bigger, they're not increasing in number, they're increasing in size. So your muscle fiber diameter gets bigger. You're not actually getting more muscle fibers themselves. As always, your energy gets produced, or the ATP gets produced from the mitochondria. And a motor unit here, just so we're aware, is a motor neuron plus a muscle fiber. So what we can see here is that your motor neurons are the nerves that connect from your spinal cord, or from your central nervous system, to the muscles themselves. So each of these motor neurons or nerve cells will attach to the muscle fiber itself. The junction that forms between those two, so the adding together of this neuron with the muscle fiber, gives you a motor unit. And your motor units are the actual functional units of our skeletal muscle. Now, getting into how the contraction actually happens. You get any sort of nerve impulse, or any kind of an actual nerve activation via an action potential. What an action potential is it's a single nerve impulse. So this is a single one-time use for the nerve firing. This happens in what's known as an all or nothing event. You either get a complete nerve impulse to occur or nothing occurs. Now, when you have your action potentials or your nerves firing frequently, the frequency at which they fire is called your firing rate, or your nerve impulse rate. This is going to change based on the amount of motor units you have and where the nerve cells are and what they're actually doing. Now, to break this down, we have primarily 4 main points to look at with this. At rest, this bar here, this is our resting membrane potential. Nothing's happening. We are at a negative 90 millivolt range here. That doesn't really mean a whole lot for us, but it's just something to keep in mind. When you're at rest, you have negative electricity. Now, when an action potential begins to occur, you start this process here where you're getting more energy or more positive energy going to your nerve cell. You hit this point called the threshold level, which is right here. While it's not really shown too well, the threshold level is actually at negative 55 millivolts. Once you pass this, the entire action potential occurs. So you get that nerve to fire. If you didn't reach that, this would peter out and go back to resting. So nothing would happen. Once you reach that threshold level, now you go through this phase called depolarization. When the nerve depolarizes, you actually get sodium channels to open. So what happens here is you get a very, very rapid rise in the overall electricity of the nerve here. Once you hit this top point, you now are going through a repolarization phase. So from here to here, this is the active phase of your action potential. This is the only time it's really active. It's once you pass that threshold level to when you go back below that threshold level. Once you pass this repolarization phase, so on the way up, you'll pass repolarization. That's when your sodium channels are going to close and your potassium channels are going to open. When this happens, essentially the energy is going to stop. So it takes some time to slow down, and then you get to the top of your roller coaster and go back down. After you reach below that zero, now your sodium channels are going to open again, but your potassium channels are actually going to stay open. Then once you reach back to where that resting level would be, your body kind of goes into a emergency braking where it'll stop just so it can get back to where its resting state is. So it's kind of like if you ride a roller coaster, you go up the roller coaster and you go down at a slope. And then when you come to the bottom, you don't just hit the bottom straight away and make a 90-degree turn. You ease into it, or you have that nice, good roll into it. So, the cars don't crash. Same thing happens with our electricity system in our body. Once we get to the bottom there, we don't just stop and then make a 90-degree turn. You go and you ease into it. So you go down and you curve into it. Well, on that way, when you go down, you actually have to overshoot your end and then you come back up. This here, once you hit this phase here, up to the point where you get back to that resting membrane potential, this is hyperpolarization. The other term for this is your refractory period. This is the time at which you cannot have another action potential. You cannot have another nerve impulse because you have to wait until the nerve's electricity levels get back to their resting level. Once they get back to that resting membrane potential, that resting level, now you are able to have another action potential. During this here, when you're below that, you cannot have another action potential. So in short, you receive a stimulus. When if that stimulus is enough to pass you over your threshold level, the nerve impulse occurs. After the nerve impulse occurs, and during this time, this is when you would get movement, you go through a period where you have less than resting amounts of electricity, called your refractory period, where you cannot have your nerve impulse occur again. Once you reach again the resting membrane potential, you can again then have another nerve impulse. Now, all this is good, but what it actually means is that we in turn get a muscle contraction. So when you actually have a muscle contraction, you are getting the actin and myosin proteins or the filaments to cross over each other, just like we saw with the sliding filament theory we talked about in our last video. Now, when the muscle contraction occurs, you measure this in terms of two variables. You have force and you have length. And we'll see in the next slide how this relates to our actual muscle contraction types. Force is further broken down into two subcategories, tension and load. When you have tension on a muscle, the muscle itself is working. So if I have tension on my bicep here, that means that my bicep is exerting a force onto an object. So if I were trying to pick up this tape measure here and I have tension on it, my muscle or my bicep here is exerting a force onto the tape measure so that I can lift it. Conversely, a load is the amount of force that's exerted on my muscle from the object I'm lifting. So I'm holding this tape measure. This tape measure, because it has mass, it exerts a force on my muscle. I have to contract my muscle to be able to lift this. Now, when tension or the relationship between tension and load determines the direction at which our muscles go, otherwise known as the length of the muscle. So if your tension is greater than your load, your length is going to increase. If my tension is less than my load, sorry, I told you that backwards there. So if my tension is greater than my load, my length decreases. So that means that the tension in my muscle, the force my muscle is exerting on my load, is greater than the amount of force the load's exerting on me. When I do that, my muscle contracts, the length of my muscle fibers get shorter. When I have my tension less than the amount of the load, so meaning the load is exerting more force than what my muscle can produce in tension, my muscle will lengthen. So this produces a lengthening, this produces a shortening. And now when we look at the actual classifications of our muscle contraction, it'll make a lot more sense here. You have two classifications of muscle contractions, isometric and isotonic. Isometric contractions are when we have contractions without movement. Isometric means that your tension equals your load. If they equal each other, so if the force from my load equals the force I can produce in my arm, nothing moves because one does not outweigh the other. I can't move my muscle or I can't change the length of my muscle because the force I produce and the force of the load are equal. The only way muscle movement occurs via a contraction is if the tension is greater or the load is greater than the tension. There has to be an imbalance between the two or else no movement occurs. Now, that happens when you have an isotonic contraction. So an isotonic contraction is when you have contraction with movement. You have two subsets of this. You have eccentric and you have concentric. An eccentric contraction is contraction with lengthening. A concentric contraction is contraction with shortening. We can think of this here as this dumbbell being my load and the muscle itself being my tension. So when I have a concentric contraction, it means that the tension I have is greater than the load force, and I get muscle shortening. When I have an eccentric contraction, it means that the tension my muscle produces is less than the load I'm lifting, and my muscle lengthens. So let's say I'm doing a bicep curl here. When I curl my arm, and let's imagine I'm holding something. So I'll take this goniometer here, and we'll call this my dumbbell. So nice little goniometer there. When I have an concentric contraction, I am producing more force with my bicep than the load on which I'm lifting. This means that this muscle in my arm, my bicep, produces more force than how much force or how much weight or mass the goniometer has on me. When this happens, my muscle belly shortens, and this is also like how you would flex your muscle. Now, if the load on my dumbbell here is greater than what I can produce, it means that the force I have for my arm is less than the load here. I cannot hold that load up, and my arm will lengthen, or the muscle will lengthen. That is your eccentric contraction there. So eccentric, the load is greater than the force you can produce. Concentric, the load is less than the force you can produce. A concentric contraction is contraction with muscle shortening. An eccentric contraction is contraction with muscle lengthening. Now, this gets more into our movement analysis here, but this is a good thing to keep in mind because this will help when you actually are looking at specific exercises to think about how muscle movements really occur. We have 4 types of movements with the muscle. So when you talk about how a muscle moves, you talk about which muscles are actually doing the movement. So you have an agonist, an antagonist, a synergist, and a stabilizer. Your agonist is your prime mover. If I am doing a bicep curl, the muscle that moves my arm in this motion is my bicep. My bicep is my prime mover. My antagonist opposes the prime mover. So if you antagonize somebody, you are just egging them on. You're doing something that they don't want you to do. So if I do this, my antagonist is my triceps, because my triceps is responsible for making my arm extend or my elbow extend. Biceps makes my elbow flex. So if I'm flexing my arm, my triceps does not want that to happen. They are the antagonist. They will oppose that movement. Now, a synergist does the exact same motion or movement as the agonist or the prime mover, but typically they're smaller muscles. In your arm, you have 3 main elbow flexors. You have your biceps, you have brachialis, and you have brachioradialis. Brachialis and your biceps are going to be the 2 more powerful flexors. Brachioradialis is a lot smaller of a muscle. Typically, your synergist muscles are small muscles. They'll do the exact same thing. So brachioradialis still does elbow flexion, but it's not the primary mover. So it's a helping muscle. Synergists are helpers. Now, a stabilizer is kind of similar to a synergist, but this is used so that one muscle group or one joint can stay locked in place so that another one can move. So an example of this would be if I'm doing my bicep curl, but I'm standing up. So I'm going to take my left arm here to do the bicep curl. if I were to normally do this bicep curl, and let's look at this from the side here, and let's say I go to do my curl and I'm lifting too much weight. A very common compensation you see when people do a bicep curl is they'll lift and they'll arch their back, which you don't want to do. A stabilizer here would be my core. So my abs, my obliques, my low back, my glutes, my hip abductors, my hip flexors. They all form this lower cross that you have across your pelvis. But in short, if I tighten my tummy, so I tighten my belly, it's going to stabilize my whole body. So now when I go to do this, I can stay in a better erect position without moving. My core or my abs have stabilized my spine, so they help prevent my spine from arching back. When I then tighten my belly and I do my bicep curl, now my spine is stabilized. It's not going to do this. My spine stabilizes so that all of the work or all the effort can be put onto my elbow. So that is our overview here of muscle contractions and action potentials. And then when we come back next time, we are going to be getting into this a little bit deeper on how these motor units work in all practicality. And then we'll move on from there. So until next time, I will see you all later.